Hello, and thanks for joining us today for ACI Learning's Audit webinar. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box and we will answer as many as we can at the end. Now let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the ACI Learning webinar series. I'm so glad that you've joined us. Today our presenter, Dr. Hernan Murdock, will talk about the evolution of internal audit alongside IT Pro TV's edutainer, Wes Bryan. Hernan speaks at conferences in the United States and abroad and is the author of numerous articles and books on a variety of topics, including internal audit, fraud, and more. He holds professional designations as a CIA and a CRMA. He currently serves as the Vice President of Audit Content at ACI Learning, and prior to that, he was a Senior Project Manager leading audit and consulting projects for clients in the manufacturing, transportation, high-tech, education, insurance, and power generation industries. Wes is an IT instructor with over 10 years of experience. In his first year of teaching, Wes won the Global Teaching Award 3 times, and he holds certifications in CompTIA A+, Network Plus, Cloud Plus, and many more. So, what exactly is ACI Learning? ACI Learning trains leaders in audit, cybersecurity, and IT, delivering lifetime learning to over 250,000 engaged students, professionals, and organizations across 6 continents. Many of you attending today may know or have heard of MIS Training Institute, or MISTI. MISTI has been training auditors, risk and compliance, fraud, and information security professionals worldwide for over 40 years. MISTI is now part of and is being rebranded as ACI Learning. Check us out at acilearning.com and follow us on your favorite social media. We'd love to get questions from you as we go along, so please put your questions in the question panel in GoToWebinar on the right side of your screen. We'll be sure to get to your questions after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you within a week. You can also download today's slides and any additional handouts by clicking on the links in the handout panel. Now, let's welcome Hernan and Wes to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. Where do you want to begin?
Hello, and thank you, Kelly, and Dr. Hernan. It's a pleasure to be in the studios with you again and joining you with this webinar. We're going to be talking about the evolution of internal audit today. How are you doing?
I am doing very well and very excited to talk about this topic.
All right, so let's go ahead. As we get started here in the evolution of an internal audit, we're going to have to talk about some changes that are going on. So what do you say we go ahead and we just dive right into today's topics, talking about some key changes here, Doctor?
Sounds very good. Yes, indeed. A lot of the things that have happened over the last few years have definitely transformed the profession of internal auditing. In fact, it has transformed just about every line of work. But we are focusing here on what auditors do and some of the challenges that they have encountered and some of the benefits that some of these changes have brought about. So, as we talk about changes, there are a lot of different things that have impacted the work that we do and the clients that we serve. So, for example, if we were to think about some of these changes in terms of the technological type changes, the ones that have impacted technology, let's call it directly, we have a number of different things that have happened. For example, we have increasing computing capabilities. People can now do things that were just imagined a few years back. And when I say a few years, sometimes it's just as few as 5 years ago. A lot of auditors are familiar with tools like Excel that just about everyone uses, and the capability has increased substantially from its early days. So we're now able to do a lot more with these tools that just about everyone has, and the price has been very low. So that allows us to do more with less. So that's one thing to highlight, for example. Then we have digitization. The fact that so much has now been imaged and we now have data capture and we have a lot of these things in databases. We, for decades, talked about a paperless world and being able to do a lot of things without having to rely on paper and files and binders. And because of what has happened with technology, but also in many cases as a result of COVID and the pandemic and how it's really forced individuals to work remotely, organizations have definitely made a huge and very rapid push towards digitizing everything. So that has been a very interesting transformation there too, because now we can do some of the things we were only thinking and imagining about a few years back. More auditors and compliance professionals can now do those things because now we have the information in digital form. The third thing I'd like to highlight is communication. the practice for internal auditors and compliance professionals and consultants and so on was, in many cases, to travel to the location and see and do things on site. And a lot of that is starting to come back now as the pandemic starts to recede a bit and people start to go back to on-site work. But a lot of things have now been enabled as a result of technology. So now we are able to have a lot of video calls, which have been around for a while, but the scale of it has increased in such a rapid rate that now we're able to leverage communication in terms of video, audio, of course, but we also have a lot of instant messaging. And it's not just what you do with your phone, which is kind of what a lot of people used to think about, and a few tools here and there. But by and large now we have things like Teams, for example, that a lot of organizations have embraced, and there, of course, are other tools. But these have enabled the ability to communicate with people across the world. So distance and time and location really doesn't matter as much, because now we're able to communicate with people real time and have that text chat. So that enables quite a few things that in many cases were somewhat limited for a lot of people.
Definitely. I could see Hernan in, just the last few years, especially in the current day and age where communication, especially in a work from home environment, is so important, where the technology has rapidly changed. I remember just 10 years ago when we were setting up things like high definition conferencing systems to be able to do that very thing that we kind of take for granted today. It was very, very expensive and it wasn't scalable. So that times have definitely changed. Now, when it comes to some of these key changes, how does that affect, let's say, the social nature of change?
Yes, that's another interesting change that has happened over the last few years. You're right. So one of the things, for example, that we have noticed is diversity. And we can talk about diversity in a number of different dimensions. Sometimes people talk about it in terms of racial diversity, sometimes religious diversity, ethnic background, gender, age. All of those things have happened and they're all relevant. Another one that I like to highlight that has been a very important key change in audit is the diversity in terms of the background of the practitioners or the professionals. In the past, auditors were by and large accountants who had moved from accounting into audit, or they were raised, brought up, developed professionally in the field of audit, primarily external audit. What we have witnessed over the last 20 to 30 years is that movement towards internal auditors coming into their own profession, having that professionalism, those standards, those accreditations, certifications, the training, the expertise, the recognition, all of those things have improved, partly through the lot of advocacy work that we have done. And of course, now we have a huge body of work that we can reflect back on. So auditors are much more diverse now. Yes, a lot of auditors are still accounting and financial professionals. That's their background, their training in college and otherwise. But we're also running into very many scenarios where the auditors are IT experts, cybersecurity experts, process improvement experts, re-engineering experts. You have a lot of dynamics around healthcare. You have engineering. I've trained so many civil engineers, geologists. Interestingly enough, many years ago, but still remember it, not that many years ago, but a few years back, I remember doing a training, and at a multinational bank, they had a cultural anthropologist in the audit department. And it turns out, after some conversation and inquiring as to what their strategic initiatives were, it turns out that this person was hired because of that very expertise. As a multinational organization, they needed someone who understood culture and how culture influenced decision making. They had had some issues with ethics and some compliance breakdowns. Therefore, someone with that expertise was really important to them. And that's how that happened. So now my role at that point was to help them, as far as training goes, to help this individual understand the business side of things and some of the regulatory dynamics and compliance requirements, so that then he could bring his expertise in culture with the business side and then be able to do the audits. So again, I bring this as an example because it helped me really open my eyes quite a bit to realize just how far we had come and how much we value that. And one last thing I want to highlight is the importance of communication skills, being able to write clearly and correctly and promptly, quickly, speak clearly, present well. All of these dynamics are also very important. So we're now looking at a lot of auditors with liberal arts backgrounds. So that's, again, very important there, and that's social dimension. So let's talk about For example, the turnover dynamic, where we see increased turnover. And part of that is in this category of social because it's in some cases a generational thing. Not exclusively, but by and large. We have a lot of individuals who now join organizations and they see it as a stepping stone, as a piece of or a part of their career progression, and they don't see themselves as career or lifelong auditors. They may want to move into operations or move into consulting or something else, and that's okay. But what we need to understand is that that willingness of individuals to move also brings some new talent in frequently, new ideas frequently, but we also need to train differently and deploy people differently. So this is another interesting change that has its pros and cons, if you want to call some of those dynamics cons. But by and large, they definitely changed the dynamic around it. And then a couple other things in terms of the stakeholder focus. We're now looking at all the stakeholders as best we can serve them all the relevant ones, of course. So we're looking in terms of how the work of organizations impact not just the shareholders, but you also have the tax authorities, you have employees, you have vendors, you have customers, you have local communities, you have environmental groups. There are so many constituents. So now internal auditors are not only looking at the accounting implications of the work of the organization, but they're also looking at some of the other impacts. So broadening the scope of the work. And lastly, certifications. So as I mentioned earlier, we are looking and now working with people who have backgrounds much more diverse than just accounting. So we have individuals that have the CIA certification, like I do, certified internal auditor. Different, broader than just accounting and tax, which tends to be the focus of the CPA. We are looking at IT and cybersecurity and operations management and statistics and economics and politics and how all of these things impact the work of organizations, and hence the name internal auditors. All of the dynamics internal to the organization and of course how they impact externally, but how do all of these things come together to determine the success or failure of the organization?
Dr. Hernan, I think it's interesting, because I would have looked at something like turnover and said, hey, this isn't really a good thing, but you've helped me put a different, set of lenses on and see that it's not actually as bad as, I would take that from the beginning. You mentioned a word that I kind of stuck on there. You said economics. Can we talk a little bit about the key changes in that area when we focus on economics?
Absolutely, yes. So just think of it from this perspective. If you were kind of that traditional, let's call it old school auditor, right? And you're looking in terms of the organization's debt position. So you look at the records and you see, okay, what is our debt position? What is the interest rate? What are the terms? Did the right people sign off for this thing? Are we making the payments like we're supposed to? Are we allocating and accruing like we're supposed to? And we basically make sure all of those accounting dynamics are addressed appropriately. Now, if you fast forward to some of the concerns we have now that we focus mostly on risk, all of those things are still relevant and important. We need to make sure that happens. But we also start to wonder if these loans, for example, are variable rate loans. If our position is significant in terms of the balances that we carry, how will an increase in interest rates, like we're experiencing now, for example, how would that impact the organization? And at what point could we run into trouble in terms of liquidity and even solvency? So we need to think broader, in a more broader sense, about how, for example, the economic dynamics will impact the organization. And this debt position now is looked at a little bit differently, or more broadly, I should say, because you still look at those compliance and accounting and financial reporting elements, but then you look in terms of how that might impact the organization going forward. And then we may want to talk with the treasurer, and just to make sure that all of those things are being monitored appropriately. I'll give you another example. Supply chain dynamics, which a lot of it has to do with operations, but the economy also plays a role. So when you're looking at disruptions at the macro level, then the organization needs to take a look at that, and hopefully they did that before it happened. But if not, make sure that there's a good amount of assessment going on in terms of how the supply chain disruptions that are happening at the economic level impact the organization, because that has ramifications to vendor selection, continuity of work, in terms of whether or not we're going to be able to meet our customer needs. So those dynamics also play a role. And of course, unemployment could also play a big role. If you can't find the people you need, you're going to have difficulty meeting your mission. So all of these things are good examples of where the economy plays a role in this equation.
And we've definitely seen that too, especially coming from the realm of IT like I do, that we've seen, like for instance in Silicon Valley, it's very hard to get CPUs now, and it has been for a while. If you go back a little bit farther, when the Bitcoin mining started and took off, it was very hard to find things like graphics cards. And I can only imagine that if you have OEMs that like to build machines and they need those parts and they don't have those parts, it can definitely have an adverse effect on their company and their company's productivity. Now, you've mentioned this term a couple of times. When it comes to key changes, can we focus a little bit more in the area around risk and risks in general?
Yes. So I'll pick up on what you said earlier about economy and your question around there, and we can bring it back to this point because
Sure.
you touched on a couple of things that fit right into that as we make this transition. Because when we think, for example, about organizations that are larger and global, then we think in terms of, to your point, about getting the parts, maybe chips or boards and different components. How are you going to get what you need so you can maybe build a subassembly and make the final product and then be able to ship? So the global organization, which is part of that economic dynamic, is now also dependent on a lot of other vendors. Whereas in the past, maybe you made most of what you were eventually selling. Now you're sourcing a lot of what you're eventually selling. So this brings us to this area now of risk, like you highlighted. These dynamics, although they're very helpful in one way, they can also create risk and uncertainty in another, because if there's disruption, what do you do now? If the currency, for example, moves, once again, going back to economics and bringing it back to risk. If the currency devalues substantially and your obligations are in certain currencies, you may find yourself with a difficulties addressing the need to pay when you cannot make that difference in terms of the currency exchange. So those dynamics can be very troublesome. So cybersecurity is another thing to highlight here when it comes to how malware has propagated and is impacting organizations. Things like ransomware, for example, and denial of service attacks and other dynamics like those really put organizations on their toes trying to figure out, well, what do I do now? Because what's happening is that you have these threats coming and in some cases you can't see them, right? So we used to think about risk in terms of fire and flood and things like that, and those are still there. But now we're seeing threats in terms of cybersecurity, as an example. We spoke about third parties and those vendors and the supply chain. That's a good example. But let's talk about talent management and that as a risk. So we have an increase in the amount of knowledge that exists in the world and how it's easily accessible now, more so than ever before in history. At the same time, we find that in some cases, the knowledge that we need is not the knowledge that the people we recruit have. So the talent management dynamics in some cases are finding the talent you need, when you need it, where you need it, that is going to be aligned with what we're looking for. So that management is very critical to organizations now, and some organizations are struggling. We spoke earlier about the pandemic and how the communication technology enabled people to work from anywhere. And we even have a term, right? Work from home. That in many cases was necessary to address the pandemic and all of the issues around it. It also enabled the hiring of people who could then work remotely. Many organizations were reluctant to do it. Some of them were just kind of trying it out, but they had to do it. As a result of the issues we encountered. But that also raises issues around how do we keep these people engaged, feeling connected, building a sense of community, building engagement so that they feel part of a family of the organization. Because what may happen otherwise is that this may, in concert with what I said earlier about people leaving organizations and the retention dynamics, then yes, you may find the talent, but they don't stay around too long. So you have people who feel isolated. That can also impact, of course, morale and how people interact with each other. So we need to manage the talent and the whole worker or the workforce, right? And then the business model. Let me just wrap up this piece on that note, because this is a very, very big one too. If we think about what's happening in so many industries, let's talk about restaurants, for example, and how they could not operate for a while, but then they started shifting towards takeout. How does that impact the business model? Look at hotels and people staying at Airbnb and other organizations and services like those. You think about the taxi services and how Uber and Lyft has really changed that. When we think in terms of automobile manufacturers, and you had internal combustion, and now you're looking at the transition to electric vehicles. So the business model, how is that changing? What you used to do and now what you need to adapt to. And it's not just the primary frontline organization that has to deal with it. Automobiles, for example, but you're looking in terms of the people who source and provide them the inputs for what they do. So, and the insurance company and the lenders who lend for loans, insure automobiles, usually done at the individual level. Now we're looking at fleets. So all of these dynamics, the business models in many cases are changing quite a bit as well.
Dr. Hernan, one of the things that just kept popping up, in my mind as you were saying that was just the ability to have an adaptive business model. It seems like static business models are at high risk today of not succeeding if they cannot adapt. Now, I want to remind all of our viewers that are attending the webinar out there, keep in mind that here at ACI Learning, we are monitoring the chat, and you need to take advantage of all the wealth of knowledge that Dr. Murdock brings to the table. And ask those questions. Put those questions in chat. Keep in mind we are monitoring those, and at the end we will take those questions. Now, when we talk about risk, Dr. Murdock, we need to have some kind of countermeasures, right, that address that risk. Can we talk a little bit about controls?
Absolutely. Yes, you're right. When you have risk, the next thing to think about and talk about is controls. So we need to think about how those have evolved over time as well. We're talking about changes. And in the past, we used to think quite a bit about reconciliations and approvers and reviewers and those kinds of separation of duties and various things like those. And those still apply. But what we're seeing increasingly as a result of all of these changes happening is the role of automation in terms of how controls are designed and operating. Computers are now doing a lot of those things that used to be done manually. So internal auditors need to be aware of that and also develop their knowledge, their expertise even in terms of how systems are going to work with us and for us. So how do we automate some of these controls? And now computers can do a lot of the things that used to be very troublesome. People make mistakes, and if they have a lot of work to do, they're overworked. If they are fatigued, poorly trained, they're likely to make more mistakes. As organizations grow, remember we just spoke about global organizations, multiple currencies, time zones, volume of transactions, all of these things are changing and evolving. And as they grow, the likelihood of errors will also increase. So automation can be a great helper here. But auditors need to understand how these are built, how they work, and if there are any potential gaps in the work that they can do, the service they can provide, the coverage they can give us, so that we can then make sure that those are going to be addressed. So, automation, great help, but we need to understand how we can enable a lot of those. We have continuous monitoring, which goes hand in hand and as an extension of what I just described. So now it's not just a matter of checking things out once a year, which was fairly common for a lot of auditors and a lot of organizations. What we're looking at in many cases now is that we can't wait a full year to see if something is working or not working. Because if we let 12 months, 11 months, 10 months, in some cases even 3 months go by and something going poorly, the cumulative effect can be so damaging that is not okay anymore. So we need to also work with management and the second line, quite often compliance and different groups like those, in terms of how we can leverage automation and continuous monitoring so that the systems can tell us when something is not right. And the systems are now able to help us. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few moments when we get into a little bit more about where we're going. But this continuous monitoring dynamic has been evolving and is something to really pay attention to. And the last thing I'd like to highlight here is soft controls. So we usually talk about controls in terms of, like I said, reconciliation, separation of duties, reviewers and approvals, things like those. And those are all what we call hard controls. Soft controls are more of the environment, have a lot more to do with things like the operating style in terms of the empowerment of employees, in terms of the dynamics around what is okay and what is not okay, and the level of supervision and guidance that is provided. And those dynamics are very important. Give you an example. Empowerment is a very important piece to always consider. And I like to use the example of a lower ranking accountant in an organization who is told by a senior person within that accounting slash financial reporting type environment to do something that is not right. Recognize their revenue before we are allowed to, not write down some assets, to allocate expenses, allocate transactions to expense as opposed to capex. Those kinds of dynamics are against accounting rules. So you can have a lower ranking employee who's being told to do something, and the question then is, will this person do it? And people will say, well, they shouldn't do it. And I've been an auditor for many years. I understand the concept of shouldn't, but will they? And if they have a family, they have a job situation they don't feel they can lose, what will they do? So empowerment becomes a very important element here, because we need to help employees feel empowered to say no to things that are wrong and to be protected appropriately, so that they don't feel that they're out there on their own trying to stand for what's right. So controls can in some cases be overridden by individuals in the organization who may instruct others to do things that are unethical or illegal even. So we need to look at those things. So soft controls become very important. And in this theme that we're talking about here today, very important as far as a key change, we're recognizing the value of those things, and we're now auditing those kinds of things. Like when we do, for example, audits of the organizational culture, as an example of where this comes in.
You know, how we tackle some of these key changes and the challenges that maybe that we face when tackling them really is how we approach them. Can we talk about methodology?
Yes, absolutely. So as we bring all of these topics together, then we must eventually talk about methodology. How has our approach to auditing changed over the years? And one of the things that's become very, very, let's call it hot, right? It's become very commonplace to witness, and a lot of organizations are trying to do, is agile auditing. Agile auditing is the adaptation of agile system development methodology that started in IT and bring it into the audit field, just because we want to audit what really matters and do so faster, communicate results faster, and to take care of the customer better. And of course, communicate what needs to be communicated and document what needs to be documented. So these are some of the key tenets of agile auditing. But speed is definitely, and flexibility is definitely two key elements of this. So the methodology has moved from traditional auditing, which in many cases took months, to agile auditing, where by having different sprints and the way you configure your work, you're able to address questions, get solutions and answers, and communicate results much faster, hopefully within 3 weeks or so. So we have that. We have remote auditing, which is another very important development here, because as a result of the pandemic in some cases, but just in general, organizations were already starting to look at digitization, looking at automation and the availability of tools, and saying, do we really need to go? And if we go, for how long do we need to be there? Can we do some of the work beforehand, even during a planning phase? Can we do some of the field work from wherever we are, and then go on site maybe for something that we can better do there, or for a shorter duration? So remote auditing has definitely grown quite a bit. We've gotten much better. And I like to use the example of reviewing inventory. In the past, auditors will go to the warehouse and make sure that they took a look at the items that were there, and then verify their presence, their condition, their valuation, and various things like those. Now we're able to find other ways of doing some of those things. And this is just one example. Data mining and data analytics, data crunching has been around for decades. So I started in audit many years ago, and we were then working a bit with that, right? With what we had, and we had different tools. Like I used the word Excel earlier. We had ACL, which later became Galvanize and is rebranded further more recently. But we had a lot of different tools. And of course, now we have Power BI, we have Tableau for visualization. There are so many tools we have at our disposal. So we can do a lot of analytical work. We can do a lot of mining by going into the data sets and looking through there and seeing what's in there. And that can help us tremendously to see things that before we could not see, either as clearly or as thoroughly or at all. So now we can. So I think that that is a very important thing. And then we have AI, or artificial intelligence, which it is really, really changing so many things. It is from automation perspective, it's allowing us to work with computer systems to start looking for patterns and be an extension of us. And we are now able to see some of these technologies go down in price to the point where it's very affordable to so many organizations. We're seeing it become more commonplace and almost in our lifestyles in such a way that it is happening, it is there, and we don't even know it. So from that perspective, then our methodology now is becoming richer by being able to use some of these techniques in the audit trade and be able to use that to augment the work that we do and be able to cover more faster. And actually, I was talking to a chief audit executive some time ago, and in their organization, they actually gave this AI tool a name. It became almost like a part of the department. It had a name of what the AI tool was doing for them. So again, we can definitely see how it's becoming part of our methodology, a natural part and extension of how we go about doing our work.
Dr. Murdock, when we've identified these key changes, where does our journey take us from here?
It's going to be a very interesting future, first of all. But I think it's also going to take us places where we're going to be able to do things and avoid doing things that in some cases were just very tedious. So for example, when we talk about things like blockchain, and of course, cryptocurrency is an extension of that. But blockchain technology, let's just talk a bit about what that is. And of course, we can talk about it for a very long time. But blockchain, by taking bits of information and building like a chain link, right? We're going to have bits of information that will describe, for example, the origin of something, who the vendor was, who the buyer was, what the price is, what the date was, and so on. And then what happens with that. Now, we take that and we extend that concept throughout the supply chain that we were talking about earlier. Now, it's going to enable the ability to understand where things are coming from and be able to trace it and be able to verify. Because one of the key attributes of blockchain is that it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to change. You need a lot of rules to change anything related to it. So it becomes fixed in that sense. That's a very interesting concept that auditors and compliance professionals should entertain. Organizations are using it because it helps a lot of their processes and documentation and enabling their businesses. But for an audit perspective, it might make compliance work a lot easier once we have these elements captured, documented, and let's call it fixed, where you don't have to worry so much about whether or not what you're seeing is correct. It is there, and no change can happen unless everybody who is affiliated with this network agrees to it. And of course, you can have different levels of participants, so depending on the nature and characteristics of the blockchain. But from an audit and compliance perspective, there's a lot there that can help us out when it comes to those kinds of verification type activities that auditors engage in. Automation. So allowing us to basically look at, for example, work papers and how we're going to capture those, how we're going to do searches through it, how we're going to be able to organize them. So the automation of electronic work papers and being able to bring data and records from different sources and be able to use that to do our analysis and capture it in our electronic work paper tools. So we can then figure out what happened, communicate the results, and archive that as we move on to something else. Automation is going to free us from some of the repetitive, tedious administrative tasks. So that is going to be very helpful and very important to look at. The organizations are automating substantially. Robotic process automation, for example, we need to understand how those are designed, how they are deployed, what they do, don't do, and then how we're then going to be able to provide assurance around them. And then the third one is artificial intelligence. As the systems are able to identify anomalies, outliers, things that just don't seem to follow, fit, agree with some expectations, and be able to flag those and tell us, hey, you may want to take a look at this. It enables something that I've been advocating for a while, and I'm not just the only one. There are other practitioners who have also done this, thinking in terms of Why should an audit take several months? Of course, agile auditing helps us answer that question and streamline and reduce the turnaround time. But why can't we do an audit in 1 week? So artificial intelligence, if it's able to flag things that are not working, and if we think of it from a risk perspective and use key performance indicators and key risk indicators, then we put all of this together and we say, okay, if everything is working, that basically means that the controls are working. When something breaks, it could very well tell us that the control is not working anymore, or the risk that we were concerned about has occurred. That being the case, let's go see what happens with this thing, because here is something that is not looking right. We look at that, we find out what happened, hopefully we can work with management to get it fixed, and then we move on. We have a very narrow, very precise scope and objective. We address it, and we move on. We're not auditing controls, we're auditing risks. We're auditing the anomalies in the process. So this can enable quite a revolution in the profession.
All right. So, next coming up, how about things like machine learning? Because a lot of times you hear machine learning and AI, even though they're different, you can hear them in the same breath. And how about ESG as well?
Yes, so machine learning is where the machines, the algorithm itself is learning over time. It requires some coaching by humans, of course, especially at the very beginning, to set some parameters and expectations. But beyond that, then it starts to be able to figure out what looks okay and what does not. So from that perspective, then once again, as we see these global organizations, we see these massive amounts of transactions that are flowing through organizations every hour, never mind day, week, or month. So we have all of these transactions happening, and then we have individuals who unfortunately are trying to, in some cases, commit fraud, and they may make mistakes, and all those kinds of things may happen. The systems can then tell us when something doesn't look right and help to correct or self-correct. So we need to continue to explore what these tools can do for us and how we can better leverage them so that we can, once again, achieve our objectives and our mission and manage the risks. There's going to be some exploration around how the machines are going to do things outside the expectations of humans. So we need to be very mindful about that piece of it. And one example of that is how, for example, the whole process of building self-driven vehicles has gone through a lot of evolution, a lot of debate around what they can do and not do. There's a technological piece to it, but there's an ethical piece to it as well. So observing some of these things, reading up on it, and talking among ourselves in the profession and with business leaders and engineers and technicians, of course, that is also going to help us better understand what they can do or not, and then what kind of safeguards we need to advocate for. The other thing you mentioned, Wes, is in terms of ESG. There's a great initiative that's been going around now for a little while that brings together these three very important topics: environment, social, and governance. So as organizations adopt this stakeholder focus as opposed to just shareholder focus, we're looking in terms of what are the impacts and how are we impacting and how are we being impacted by the stakeholders in terms of environment, how much pollution we cause, what kind of stewardship we show in terms of what we do and how we conduct our business. That's part of it. We look in terms of the social impacts and how we're contributing to strengthening the social environment and the communities where we operate, and in the governance, that which of course is pretty much central, if not central, at least like a backbone to a lot of what auditors are really doing, which is making sure that there's proper governance in organizations. So it's changing our focus a bit and elevating our work away from not just transaction level, but more strategic level.
Dr. Hernan, we've got a couple more topics that I'd love to get your insight on, like, for instance, 5P, and then IT and cybersecurity. They have to come into play too as well, right?
Yes, so let's do this. So let me talk a bit about the 5P approach or framework, and then we'll wrap up with the IT. So the 5P is similar to ESG in that it picks up on several themes. So planet, which in some ways may be aligned with environment, the public, right? The stakeholder view on the communities where you operate, the profession, making it more known, making sure that it is regarded highly, and that it has the right placement in the organizational structure and the respect that it deserves, and how it's going to be viewed and used by and with other governance-minded entities in the organization. Prosperity and how we're going to help to elevate employees, vendors, customers, communities, and so on, how we're going to create value, and how we treat people. So that's a very interesting framework that is fairly new, that I've been very curious about and very interested in. I definitely think it has a rightful place in our environment. And then lastly, as IT and cybersecurity goes, it's a risk, it's an opportunity, it's something that we need to be mindful about. And as far as where do we go, I think that auditors need to keep abreast and expand their skill set to, if you are a business auditor, if you're a tax, if you're an accountant, or any of those business-like focused strains within audit, that they also expand into the IT and cybersecurity. A lot of our future as an individual and as a profession is going to depend on our ability to understand and help organizations protect when it comes to IT and cybersecurity. So I think it's something that we need to keep an eye on, because that's the direction we're going. Technology will continue to play a very important role in the future of organizations and our society, and auditors need to understand it and be able to help the organizations derive value from it and manage the potential risks that are on the sidelines as well.
Dr. Murdock, thank you so much for your insights on that. And to all of our viewers out there, keep in mind, stay tuned, because we still have to get to your questions. But before we do that, Kelly is going to tell us a little bit about Audit Pro TV.
Thanks, Hernan and Wes. To our viewers, if you have any questions, be sure to enter them right now in the chat panel on the right side of your screen. Before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to tell you about Audit Pro TV. Audit Pro TV is subscription-based, on-demand CPE learning that's effective and engaging. A one-year subscription costs less than 3 days in a classroom, and it allows you to gain access to a library of internal and IT audit, fraud, risk, and cybersecurity learning at any time from anywhere. Visit acilearning.com to learn more about Audit Pro TV and request your free demo to see what the fuss is all about. All right, Hernan, let's start with these questions, and we have quite a few coming in today. Coming in first from Rachel, she wants to know, will there be any changes in audit methodologies for IT systems because of all the dynamic changes?
So in terms of how we audit IT systems, there's an interesting development that I'd like to use as an example to answer this question, which I think is a fantastic one. It has to do with automation. So one of the things that was very common in the past was for people to basically go through the code when there was a system development or software developed, and to go through and make sure everything was going to be okay, and if there were any changes, that it was not going to break something else along the way. Well, now we have tools that do that for us, right? They are going to go through and check the code, make sure everything is okay, and any kind of other ramifications to it. So we have a lot of automation when it comes to reviewing code. So that's just one example of how the audit methodology needs to adapt when it comes to IT systems. Another thing that I'll use to explain that has to do, for example, with how we are going to audit systems, not just when they are already built. And I know that this is not entirely a new practice, but as I've done so many seminars over the years, even recently, I still hear from auditors who are in some cases having difficulty getting this accepted by their management teams. And I don't mean management in audit, I mean management in the organization. And that is the pre-implementation reviews. I've been advocating for a long time for auditors to find a way to work and collaborate with management so that before they start signing contracts and before they start deciding on vendors, deciding on budgets, deciding on what hardware and software and all of these other dynamics around the system development, that they start to look in terms of how auditors can provide some consulting services and help management preempt possible breakdowns. For example, change orders is a very big problem in a lot of development work. It happens in construction too, but you see it a lot in IT as well. So why is it that we're going to start to review what happens midstream in the development, or worse yet, at the end of the development, after they already chose the wrong vendors, sign the wrong contracts, don't have a right to audit, don't get reporting and performance metrics put in place. Change orders are too loose and it's just creating a problem with budgets. Timelines are being missed. There's so many things that can go wrong. So I believe that one of the things to consider is using automation where we need to, and then trying to provide more consultative advisory services early on. I have this expression that I like to share, and that is build right and run right. As auditors, we have focused for decades on run right, or whether or not it is not run right. So looking in terms of what happens on an ongoing basis. That's okay, we need to do that. But build right has to do with making sure the right procedures, policies, and gates are put in place so that we don't lose value as we try to create value. So build right has to do with the right policies, the right mechanisms to make sure that some of the things that I highlighted are going to be addressed appropriately, so then later on we don't have to go try to find ways to fix issues. So those are some of the ways that I can suggest that be improved.
That's some great information. Nadia is also checking in today, and she wants to know, what are useful certifications with an internal auditor? What should they have? What kind of certifications?
Yes, so I think the CIA, Certified Internal Auditor, is a very good place to start. It's a broad certification. It's going to touch on accounting and finance and financial reporting and systems and operations and economics and statistics. There are a lot of things that go into it because the work of internal auditors is very diverse. And it has also gained a lot more recognition. In the past, we used to gravitate towards CPA or the similar or equivalent CA in Commonwealth countries. So we had the Chartered Accountant or Certified Public Accountant, and that was accounting and tax focus primarily. Auditors do a lot more. So the CIA is a good place to start. Now, as you continue in your career and as you want to broaden your skill set, there are a number of other things to consider. There's the CISA, for example, CISA, that is going to give you a fairly good background in terms of IT. And then we have, for example, the CFE in terms of fraud. As you go more towards IT, you can also start looking at CISSP, which is more security focused. So those are four that I will encourage people to take a look at initially. And then there are a few others they can also explore. One of them, before I move on, is the project management, the PMP. I think it's been very helpful for a lot of auditors, and I've worked in many organizations over the years and spoken with a lot of practitioners who have found it to be very helpful because of the focus on project management. So if you're doing, for example, construction audits, infrastructure projects, government work in many cases, if you're looking in terms of IT development, the PMP credential can be very helpful to you there as well. So these are four I would suggest people take a look at least to start out.
Awesome. And I'm on LinkedIn all the time, and I've been seeing a lot of people posting their PMP certifications. So that's great information that hopefully will be useful for some out there. Now, we have Hazim checking in today. He wants to know, how much is performance audit part of the internal audit function, and what are the trends there?
Yes, performance audit. So a lot of that has to do with that run right aspect that I highlighted just a moment ago. But part of that is looking in terms of operation dynamics, right? So how is the organization doing its work? And there are three primary E's: the economy, effectiveness, and efficiency. I have spoken in another settings about how I've kind of expanded that to 8 E's. And I believe that there's a lot that we can do to help the organization. So to the question in terms of what are the trends there, I think broadening the scope of the work. It is not just what they're doing now and whether they're doing it well, but whether they're doing the right thing, whether they are setting things up. So organizational structure matters quite a bit. Looking in terms of engagement of workers, you can have all the policies and procedures, documents in the world. It doesn't mean people are going to work efficiently and be engaged and be creative in their work. So that's why I expanded. That's one of the reasons why I expanded it from 3 to 8 E's, because I believe that there's engagement considerations, there are equity and ethics, and there are environmental considerations there as well. So these are some of the trends that I see, but part of it also has to do with more analytical So quantitative and qualitative elements. And if you focus a bit in terms, and I've done this quite a bit over my career and also as an instructor and as an author, it has to do in terms of, for example, looking at how we can look at other disciplines to start to look at some very well-developed methodologies. So, for example, Six Sigma or Lean has some great methodology you can borrow there. If you look in terms of re-engineering and change management, there's a lot in their methodologies. In terms of process management or operations management, there are a lot of different things there that can help us in terms of quantifying the rate at which things are happening. And one last thing I'd like to highlight is cycle time. There are so many areas where auditors have done reviews, in some cases repeatedly over many years, and they have focused on things other than, for example, cycle time. The process takes too long, but they are checking every box and they're filling out every form, they're filling out every template, and we have all 6 people sign off on this particular thing, but the customer is not happy because it takes too long to get done. So those are some of the ways and things that I believe we should be doing that will help make those performance reviews far more effective and efficient, and to add more value to the client. And what I keep advocating is, how do we wow the client? How do we impress the client with something they did not know, and the auditor helping move the business forward? So if we can do some of those things, I believe your performance reviews are going to be far more impactful, and I think it's going to get you some recognition within the organization.
Awesome. And some of our viewers are chiming in. I know you touched on it a little bit earlier, the 3 E's. They want to write down the 3 E's. Can you go ahead and repeat that for them?
Gladly, yes. So economy, how much are things cost, or are you paying what things are worth? And that goes into any input. Could be material, could be labor, could be any of those. So that's economy. We have efficiency. How well are they consuming the inputs that they already brought into that process? So you can have a lot of waste, the counterpart to efficiency, right? That they're not really getting the work done and they're consuming or burning a lot of their resources. And you can think of it like a vehicle. You have a truck that has a very inefficient route and they're burning a lot of fuel, oil, and tires and brakes as they try to do their work. They could have done it better. And then we have effectiveness, which has to do with the achievement of goals. In some organizations, the goals aren't even well spelled out. They're not even clear to people. They're just busy doing work, but they don't know what the goals are and how they're being measured. So effectiveness has to do with, are they achieving their goals, and to what extent? You can achieve your goals 125%. That could be brilliant. You're achieving your goals at 65%. You're really under, right? So again, to what extent have they been documented, tracked, achieved, and it's really supporting your mission? So those are the 3 E's.
Thank you so much. And you know what? The 3 E's can be applied in so many different arenas in life. Agnieszka is wanting to know, could you recommend some valuable literature in the subject of internal audit related to technology or fresh new perspective of science?
There's a lot that is happening out there. Some of the big consulting and accounting firms publish reports frequently. There is a lot happening in terms of the courseware that we put together, for example, here at ACI and other organizations, where we are constantly updating the content that we deliver. Now, if you're thinking beyond just courses, we also have, for example, webcasts like this one, and we have these frequently as well, where we have practitioners and people who are well aware of what's happening in our environment talk and provide very up-to-date, very tactical, yet strategic insights on what kinds of things to focus on. I do some of that in some of the things that I write, so you can also look at some of that. But yes, there's a lot out there, and it's a matter of constantly keeping up with those and looking out for those, because there's some very authoritative sources that will provide some good insights that you can keep up with.
All righty. And last question is coming from Nathan. Nathan wants to know, are they doing more IT systems evaluation than audit?
I am not sure exactly who they are, but system evaluations than audits. I guess there are a couple of different ways I can think of that question. One of them is the difference between evaluations and audit, and I've run into this in several instances where there are assessments, there are evaluation, there are audits, and various things like those. So the system evaluation can do in some cases with how it was conceived, whether or not the right goals and functionality is going to be built. And I have seen over my career various instances where systems were over-engineered. They do what the engineers wanted to do, but the users are finding it very difficult to operate. So the usability factor is very low, and that creates all kinds of problems, one of which is underutilizing the system and creating parallel processes and other tools that they put in line to deal with the limitations of this multi-million-dollar system they built. So that's one way to think of it. The other one, for example, can be in terms of whether or not it interfaces with other systems. So you build a system, but it works in a vacuum. What you then need to do is you have to do manual adjustments, interventions where you're going to either bring in a summary total, but the detail is going to be somewhere else. You need to do manual adjustments, right? Consolidation is very difficult. So that kind of evaluation in terms of the interface and the ability of the system to connect to other systems that you will logically hope they will have connected to, but they don't. So I can think of those things falling into that realm of evaluation, because from an audit perspective, the system does what it's supposed to, right? If you put air quotes around supposed to, it does what the specs say, but it's not really from an operational perspective ideal. And we have a lot of limitations. So these are some of the things that come to mind. So are they doing more of those things? I will hope that auditors, as they look at their audit plan and as they look at the needs of the organization, the strategic initiatives, and where the investments are being made and what kinds of things the organization is working on, that is going to spend enough time looking at those dynamics as well. So we audit, if you want to use the more traditional definition of audit in terms of are they complying with a lot of the requirements that are there? Well, okay, we're doing what we need to do there, but we're also providing additional services in terms of the usability, in terms of the efficiency, in terms of the capacity, and those other attributes that will raise the return on investment on system development work.
All right, gentlemen, what a great webinar this was today. Dr. Hernan, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with before we conclude?
Well, I'm very excited about the future. There are lots of interesting and exciting things coming our way. We just need to be aware. We need to keep reading, watching, listening, trying to keep up with it, and talk to other people. We like to talk among auditors about what we do and what concerns our colleagues have, and that's something we need to continue doing, but also talk to others in different fields. And as you talk to your IT, your cybersecurity, your compliance, and management consultants and other people, always be curious, and you're going to find that there are a lot of opportunities and in some cases some risks and challenges, but that's what makes our profession so exciting. So stay tuned as we see all of these things evolve. I think it's going to be a fun ride.
Thank you, everyone. We've run out of time here for this webinar. For Hernan Murdock and Wes Bryan, I'm Kelly Mack. Thank you for joining us, and we really hope to see you again here soon.
Thank you for joining today's webinar. You will receive a link to the webinar recording delivered to your inbox. See you next time.